Welcome to the Sci-Fi Codes channel. Have fun listening to this story. Don't forget to subscribe. With the subscribe button, Chapter 1, The Veteran's Tale. In the dim, smoky bar of a bustling space station, a young alien journalist with curious, twitching antennae leaned forward toward a grizzled Kerr veteran. His worn, plated exoskeleton showed scars from battles past, and his mandibles clicked as he took a slow sip from his drink. She had heard whispers of the human wars. Their battles were already infamous, but first-hand accounts were rare. Most Kerr veterans preferred to leave the horrors behind. Yet this one, older and hardened, seemed different. With a sidelong look at her, he began to talk. "Want to know why we lost the war?" he rasped, his voice gravelly and harsh. She nodded, her eagerness barely restrained. "We never stood a chance against those primates. You think you understand violence, combat?" His eyes gleamed in the dim light. "You don't know the first thing. Humans, they turned warfare into an art." The journalist opened her mouth, ready to counter with the undeniable technological superiority of the Empire. The Kerr had always prided themselves on having the best technology in the galaxy, advanced plasma weapons, and flawless geometric battle formations. But the veteran's laughter, a harsh, chittering sound, cut her off. "That's what you all think. Military superiority?" He shook his head, the mirthless chittering stopping as he took another long drink. "Humanity didn't need better technology. While we focused on plasma and shields, you know what they perfected? The fine art of killing, creative ways to destroy each other with nothing more than metal and explosives. That's just where it begins." As the journalist took her notes, her antennae twitched. Could that really be true? Primitive weaponry over advanced energy tech? She shook her head. But he continued, describing the terrifying ingenuity of humanity's tactics. "Rocks hurled from orbit, rods from God," he said with a shudder. The devastation they could wreak on his comrades with mere kinetic energy was something the Kerr hadn't accounted for. It became increasingly clear that the veteran wasn't just recounting a war story. He was unraveling the mindset of a species that viewed warfare as a lifelong obsession, something honed and crafted to deadly perfection over millennia. What the Kerr saw as mere brutality, humans saw as efficiency. As she watched his mandibles twitch in remembrance, she knew this was just the beginning of a story that would be unlike any she had written. Chapter 2. The Calculated Chaos of Humanity. The veteran's memories became more vivid as he delved deeper, recounting specific engagements where the Kerr had deployed their cutting-edge battle formations. Every unit, positioned to precise degrees, moved in perfect unity, as if a single mind directed each Kerr soldier. Yet against the humans, these carefully laid plans had fallen to pieces in mere moments. "Formations," the veteran scoffed. "Humans?" They laughed. Then they started throwing rocks. No, not just rocks. Tungsten rods dropped from orbit. They called it kinetic bombardment, but it was death from above. No warning, no energy signatures, nothing. Just a chunk of metal slamming into the ground at thousands of miles per hour. And when we thought we had them, surrounded and outgunned, they'd simply scatter, vanish into the terrain, regroup, and hit us from the side. The journalist scribbled furiously, her antennae twitching with every new revelation. She had grown up believing the Kerr's superiority lay in their flawless organization and advanced technology. But the veteran's words chipped away at that belief. Humanity's understanding of warfare was, he explained, entirely different. They didn't merely follow strategy. They invented it on the fly. "What really got to us," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "was their creativity. You think combat is simple? Humans see the field as if it's clay, something to mold and twist. They'd take a ship's hull and turn it into a battering ram, use EMP pulses from their own reactors to disable our ships. And when they came at us, oh, they came singing." "Singing?" the journalist asked, her eyes widening. "Songs about failed parachutes, songs about blood. They called it morale." He shook his head in a mixture of awe and horror. "Who sings songs about dying?" She leaned back, processing this. Humanity's tactics were brutally efficient, their warriors bound not by regulations, but by an instinctual drive. She felt her worldview shifting, yet she hadn't fully understood the depths of what the Kerr were up against. Not yet. Chapter 3. An interview interrupted. As the journalist prepared more questions, another human entered the bar. He wore a formal uniform adorned with ribbons and medals, decorative, vibrant, almost gaudy to her. He seemed to exude a confidence, and as he approached, he gestured at the veteran's drink with a nod of respect. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, flashing a toothy smile. The journalist recoiled instinctively. Showing teeth was a gesture of aggression among her kind. But the human continued unabated, eyes twinkling with something she couldn't quite place. "Your friend here has it mostly right, but he missed the best part." She felt her curiosity tug her forward again, compelling her to ask, "The best part?" The human leaned in, as if sharing a secret. "See? He only saw us in war. That's like watching only the climax of a grand performance without knowing the rest. He doesn't understand that we don't actually want to fight. We prepare for it, sure, obsessively even. But our greatest heroes aren't the ones who've killed the most." The journalist frowned, confused. "But surely, our real heroes are the diplomats," he interrupted. "The ones who win without a single shot. We celebrate the generals who end wars, not start them." The veteran, who had been listening with a bemused expression, chittered softly. "You're saying you're pacifists?" The human chuckled, shaking his head. No. We know war too well for that. But we've learned that it's a last resort. There's a reason we're here, drinking, talking, because we won. And we won because deep down we'd rather avoid a fight if we can." He straightened, his smile fading. "But don't mistake that for weakness. When we fight with everything. And if someone pushes us, really pushes us, we won't stop until we've ended it." The journalist watched the human return to his group, suddenly realizing that humanity's strength lay not only in their battle prowess, but in their ability to wield restraint like a weapon. War for them was an art, but their true genius was in knowing when not to paint the battlefield with blood. Chapter 4. Lines crossed. Later that night, the atmosphere shifted. A broadcast blared in the corner of the bar, an alert. Pirates had attacked a civilian transport near the Carina Nebula. On board were children from the war-torn Riel sector. The joviality in the bar evaporated. Gone were the friendly smiles, the laughter. The humans who had just been singing and joking grew silent, their expressions hardening into unreadable masks. The journalist watched in fascination and horror as one human woman, previously dressed in civilian clothing, took a seat beside her with an eerie calm. "You want to know why we're called the gods of war?" she asked, her voice soft, almost gentle. "Watch what happens next." Before she could respond, the humans began mobilizing, calling others, and soon fleets of ships from all across the sector were en route to the nebula. The journalist couldn't believe what she was seeing. Species that had once been enemies were now allies, united in response to a single tragedy. "Pirates are just outlaws," the journalist murmured, confused by the human's intense response. The human's smile was cold. "Pirates? They're predators, cowards, and they broke one of our rules." The journalist tried to understand. "Rules? For war?" The human's laugh was devoid of humor. "We have lines. Lines you do not cross. Targeting children, the defenseless, that's one of them. They've just declared a war they'll regret." She gestured toward the screen. "Those ships aren't just human. Every ally we've ever made stands with us now. That's something else to remember. Humans don't fight alone." The journalist watched as reports came in. Within hours, the pirates were cornered, the refugees secured. The humans had offered the pirates a chance to surrender, and most took it. A few fought, a few fled. None succeeded, and in the end, the journalist understood that humanity's strength wasn't just in their weaponry or tactics. It was in their unwavering resolve to protect what they cherished most, by any means necessary. Chapter 5. The Art and the Mercy. The bar had returned to normal, but the journalist had changed. She watched the humans resume their singing, noting now the weight behind each song, the history and loss woven into every word. She realized their prowess lay not in brute force alone, but in their unique blend of strength and compassion, of brutal efficiency tempered by empathy. Their real power was their knowledge of when to wield war and when to wield mercy. As the last of the bar patrons drifted out, the veteran turned to her, a strange, almost reluctant respect in his eyes. "That's what makes them gods of war. They know the cost, they understand the stakes. They don't worship it, they don't rush into it, but when they decide it's time." He left the rest unsaid, and as the journalist left the bar that night, she knew that humanity's story was not merely one of war, but of choices. Choices that made them more formidable than any weapon, more fearsome than any army. It was in knowing that sometimes the greatest power of all was in the restraint not to use it. He left the rest unsaid, and as the journalist left the bar that night, she knew that humanity's story was not merely one of war, but of choices that made them more formidable than any weapon, more fearsome than any army. It was in knowing that sometimes the greatest power of all was in the restraint not to use it. Final chapter, Understanding the Gods of War. The bar had mostly emptied, leaving only a few scattered patrons as the night deepened in the bustling station at the galaxy's edge. The alien journalist's antennae drooped slightly with exhaustion, but her eyes remained sharp, fixed on the grizzled Kerr veteran who sat across from her. The story he had shared had unraveled all her previous assumptions, leaving her with a gnawing sense of both awe and unease. The veteran, lost in thought, was nursing his drink in silence. She waited, sensing that there was one last piece to his story, something he hadn't yet told her. She was still piecing together what it all meant. She had learned of humanity's brutal inventiveness, of their chaotic adaptability, their terrifying commitment to principles. But something lingered in the back of her mind, an unresolved tension she couldn't place. Finally, she broke the silence. "Tell me, after all that, after everything you witnessed, what made you stay here, in human territory? Most veterans I've spoken to, they prefer to keep their distance." The veteran looked at her, his dark, faceted eyes unreadable. "I stayed," he said, his voice rough but steady, "because I needed to understand. I've fought a lot of enemies in my life. The hardest ones are the ones you don't understand, the ones whose motivations lie hidden beneath layers of contradiction. And that's what humans are, contradiction wrapped in flesh and fury." She frowned, waiting for him to continue, to dig deeper into that mystery. "You think war is simple," he said, finally looking her in the eyes. "You think it's just about killing and surviving, about tactics and weaponry. But humanity—" He shook his head. "They've spent millennia perfecting it, yes, but it's not out of love for violence. It's a byproduct. They're artists of warfare. But their art is one of restraint, just as much as aggression." He paused, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. "In one of the battles I fought against them, we thought we had a clear advantage. We'd set a trap, expecting them to follow predictable military protocol. But they didn't. They saw our trap as if it were laid out in front of them, but instead of retreating, they walked right into it, feigning weakness." His mandibles clicked a little faster. "They let us think we were winning. By the time we realized they'd drawn us in, it was too late. They turned our trap against us, using it to surround our forces, exploiting every weakness." She felt a chill run through her as she listened. The veteran was describing more than a simple tactic. He was explaining the calculated psychology behind it. The humans had baited their enemies with vulnerability, using not just brute strength, but a cunning she hadn't considered. "But there's more to it than tactics, isn't there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The veteran nodded. "It's their capacity to make warfare personal and abstract at the same time. They see battles as part of a larger purpose, and they're willing to sacrifice, to endure horrors, if they believe it serves some greater cause. I remember the look in their eyes on the battlefield. It wasn't hatred or rage. It was determination, like they were doing something they felt was necessary." Before she could respond, a familiar figure entered the bar, the same human officer who had spoken earlier. He noticed her and approached with a faint smile, nodding in greeting. "Still picking apart our war stories?" he asked, taking a seat beside her. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I'm trying to understand what makes your people so formidable, so feared, even after all these years." The officer smiled, but there was no humor in it. "It's not about fear. Most species think we're dangerous because we're strong, because we're good at war, but that's only half of it." He paused, his eyes darkening with memories. "The other half is that we understand what war really costs. We learned the hard way, over thousands of years. Civilizations lost, entire peoples wiped out. We're not just warriors. We're survivors. We fight because we know what it's like to be broken." The veteran chittered softly, his gaze flicking between the officer and the journalist. "You think we don't understand loss?" he asked. The officer turned to him, nodding slowly. "I'm sure you do. But humans, we learn to internalize it differently. We don't just mourn our dead, we immortalize them in songs, in statues, in memories passed down. Every human who falls is remembered. Not because they died, but because they lived for something greater. That's what makes us dangerous. We fight not just for survival, but for legacy, for those who came before us and those who will come after. The journalist felt a shift in her understanding. They fought not for territory or resources, but for something far more profound. A deep-seated need to honor those who had gone before, to ensure that every loss was not in vain. War wasn't a natural instinct, but a necessary evil, and they wielded it with the precision of artisans and the reverence of priests. The officer leaned forward, his expression earnest. You wanted to know what makes us gods of war? It's that we respect it enough to never take it lightly. We know the horrors it brings, and we don't go looking for it. But when it finds us, we'll see it through to the end, not out of bloodlust, but out of respect, for ourselves, for our allies, even for our enemies. The journalist was silent, her mind racing with everything she'd learned tonight. Her species had always viewed humanity as something to be feared, a primal force with a bottomless appetite for violence. But now she saw them differently, not as conquerors, but as a people defined by their resolve, bound by principles, strengthened by resilience. She finally understood the phrase she'd heard so often, gods of war. It wasn't about power or domination. It was about conviction. Finally, she looked at the officer, her voice steady. So in the end, it's not about the weapons or the strategies. It's about the meaning behind them? The officer nodded. Exactly. Anyone can pull a trigger. Anyone can drop a bomb. But humans, we see beyond that. We see each war, each battle as a part of something bigger. And that's why we're so hard to defeat. We're not just fighting with our bodies or our weapons. We're fighting with our hearts, with our memories. We're fighting for the ones we've lost. As the officer stood and prepared to leave, he looked back at her one last time. Remember that next time you write about us. We're not the monsters you think. We're people who understand the cost of war better than anyone. And that's why we're so willing to pay it. The journalist watched him go, the final pieces of her story falling into place. She glanced back at the Kerr veteran, who was watching her with a knowing expression. Now do you see? He asked quietly. She nodded, her heart heavy with a new understanding. She would write her story, and it would be different than she had planned. She would tell the galaxy about the humans, the so-called gods of war. But she would show them not as destroyers, not as conquerors, but as something far more powerful, a species who understood the true meaning of sacrifice and the profound weight of their choices. And as she left the bar that night, she knew her perspective, and perhaps the galaxy's, would never be the same again. Before proceeding, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.